There is a man standing outside a palace in London right now. He has not spoken. He has not turned his head. People have shouted at him, laughed near him, leaned in close to take photographs, and still he has not moved. To the thousands of tourists who pass him every day, he looks almost like a statue in a tall fur cap and a red coat. But he is not a statue. He is a fully trained soldier of the British Army. And the stillness you are looking at is one of the hardest things a person can be asked to do. This is the story of who these men really are, not the myth, the truth, what the records and the regiments actually tell us, and it is far more demanding than the photographs suggest. Let's begin with what these soldiers are guarding, because that changes everything about how you see them. The duty of protecting the British monarch falls to 7 army regiments grouped together as the Household Division. These regiments are responsible for mounting the King's Guard at Buckingham Palace, St. James's Palace, Windsor Castle, the Tower of London, Horse Guards, and Clarence House, the London home of King Charles III and Queen Camilla, which sits adjacent to St. James's Palace. So when people imagine the Guard, they think only of the men outside Buckingham Palace. But the same duty quietly extends to the residence of the Queen herself, unofficial royalty. That is worth pausing on. The detachment that guards Clarence House, Camilla's London home, is part of the same ceremony, the same chain of discipline, the same code as every other sentry. During the changing of the guard, the St. James's Palace detachment, which includes the guard at Clarence House, marches the short distance along the Mall to Buckingham Palace. The men who stand near the Queen's door are bound by the exact same rules as the man being shouted at by a stranger 50 yards away. No exceptions. No softer version for the more important address, unofficial royalty. And those rules are stricter than almost anyone realizes. Let's talk about what a single shift actually looks like, because this is where the romance falls away and the reality sets in. A sentry is on duty at their post for 2 hours at a stretch. 2 hours, standing. Every 10 minutes he comes to attention, slopes arms, and marches 15 paces across the area of his post, repeating that 4 or 5 times before halting, shouldering arms, and standing at ease again. That small march you sometimes see, the sudden burst of movement, is not boredom, and it is not for show. It is built into the orders to keep the blood moving so a man does not collapse. Wikipedia. And the orders are blunt about the rest. Before each 2-hour tour of duty, instructions are read out making it clear that sentries may not eat, sleep, smoke, stand easy, sit, or lie down while on duty. Not for 2 hours. No water break when a stranger pours bottled water near your feet. No scratching an itch on your nose. No looking at the child waving at you. Wikipedia. Now hold that picture in your mind and add the heat. London summers can be heavy and humid, and these men wear thick wool tunics and a bearskin cap that adds real weight on top of the skull. People faint. It happens, and it has happened on camera many times. But here is the detail that tells you everything about the culture of this regiment. If a member of the guard faints, the protocol is to pass out while still at attention, which is why you sometimes see images of a guard lying face down, having gone down rigid rather than crumpling. Think about what that means. Even unconsciousness is supposed to be disciplined. The body gives out before the posture does. Londontopia. There is a popular story, often repeated by London guides, about the color of their trousers. According to that account, the guards wear dark trousers partly so that any unavoidable accident during those long, immovable hours is harder to see. I'll be honest with you. This one sits more in the world of London folklore than confirmed military fact, so treat it as the kind of story that gets passed around rather than a documented regulation. But it survives for a reason. It captures something true about the job. These men are asked to remain still long past the point where the body wants to move. Londontopia. So why do they do it? Why hold a posture so rigid that you would faint before breaking it? Because the stillness is not the point. The stillness is the visible part of something much older. The changing of the guard, the ceremony you've probably seen in photos, is not a tourist invention. The King's Guard in London changes in the forecourt of Buckingham Palace at 11 in the morning, daily in early summer and 4 times a week otherwise. The whole thing is a handover, the old guard relieved by the new guard, accompanied by a military band. The new guard forms up at Wellington Barracks, roughly 270 meters from Buckingham Palace, then marches across into the forecourt, advances toward the old guard in slow time and halts. The old guard presents arms, the new guard presents arms, and the captains march toward each other to hand over the palace keys. Wikipedia, unofficial royalty. The palace keys. That small gesture, one officer handing keys to another, is the heart of it. Everything else, the music, the marching, the crowds, is wrapped around a simple fact. The responsibility for these walls is being formally passed from one set of soldiers to the next, and it has been done this way in this place for centuries. Here is something most visitors get wrong, though. They assume it's all theater. It isn't. The King's Guard is not purely ceremonial. The soldiers provide sentries during the day and night, and in the later hours they patrol the grounds of the palace. The red coats and the bearskins are real soldiers from real fighting regiments. The duty rotates between the 5-foot Guards regiments, the Grenadier, Coldstream, Scots, Irish, and Welsh Guards, each with its own history and its own small marks of identity. You can tell some of them apart by the buttons. The Grenadier Guards wear single buttons and carry a grenade as their collar badge, while the Coldstream Guards wear their buttons in groups of 2 and are the oldest continuously serving regular regiment in the British Army. That's not trivia for its own sake. It means the man standing silent in front of you has, somewhere in his service, trained for far more than standing. Wikipedia +2. Which brings us to the hardest part of the job, and the part the cameras love most, the tourists. For most of their history, the sentry stood out among the public, close enough to touch. That changed, and the reason it changed is a small, almost comic incident that says a lot about human nature. Until 1959, the sentries at Buckingham Palace stood outside the fence. That stopped after an incident involving a female tourist and a Coldstream Guardsman. Worn down by constant pestering, the Guardsman kicked the tourist on the ankle as he marched past. One kick. One moment where a man who had been trained to absorb anything finally responded to being needled all day. And the response of the institution was not to punish the idea of the guard, but to move the men back behind the fence where the public could not reach them. Wikipedia. That pattern has repeated across the decades. Over time, more and more sentry posts were moved away from the public, both because tourists interfered with the work and because guards sometimes had to discipline people for dangerous or disrespectful behavior. At Windsor, the change was just as physical. Ropes were installed between the sentry posts and the public after an incident in which a tourist mocked a sentry, pretended to march alongside him, and eventually grabbed the shoulder on which the soldier's rifle was resting. Wikipedia. Read that again. The tourist grabbed the shoulder holding the rifle, and here is the part that genuinely tests your sense of fairness. The tourist complained to the police, and the sentry was confined to barracks for 10 days. Not long after, the sentries were moved inside the fence. The soldier, provoked, touched, his weapon interfered with, was the one disciplined. That is how seriously this institution takes the standard it holds its men to. The bar for a guardsman's conduct is so high that even a justified reaction can cost him. Wikipedia. So when you watch a guard absorb an insult without flinching, understand what's behind that calm. It isn't that nothing reaches him. It's that the cost of reacting has been made very, very clear. But silence is not the only tool they have, and this is where people misunderstand them most. A guard is not forbidden from acting. He is trained in a precise, escalating sequence, a protocol, for dealing with anyone who becomes a nuisance or a possible threat. Sentries receive instruction on how to remove nuisance or any suggestion of threat from members of the public, following a protocol that begins with stamping, coming sharply to attention, and a shouted warning such as, "Stand back from the King's Guard." Wikipedia. You can almost map it out step by step. First, the stamp. That sudden deafening crack of boot on stone is itself a warning. It's the soldier telling you without a word that he has noticed you and you have crossed a line. If that doesn't land, the warning becomes verbal. A guard will march up, stand his ground and shout, "Get off the fence," to someone leaning on the barrier, for example. And if a person actually climbs the barrier, the sequence sharpens, the guard shouts, "Get off the fence," shifts his weapon, stamps his foot twice, and then yells, "Get down," grunge grun. There is a logic to all of it. Each stage gives the person a chance to correct themselves before the next, firmer stage. It is, in a strange way, a deeply patient system, designed to give a warning and another before anything escalates. But it can escalate. In 2012, footage of a tourist went viral in which a Russian visitor refused to stop trying to climb the Buckingham Palace fence, even as the guard aimed his SA-80 rifle at the would-be intruder. That is the line people forget exists. The man in the costume, as some tourists treat him, is holding a service rifle, and the protocol does eventually arrive at presenting that weapon. As one London commentator puts it, you should never touch a member of the guard, and if people begin acting aggressively, the soldiers are permitted to present their bayonets. Wikipedia, the Grisly Gazette. None of this, and this is important, comes from cruelty. Their measures reflect commitment to duty rather than any personal animosity toward tourists. The guard who shouts at you is not angry at you as a person. He is executing a job whose entire purpose is to keep a boundary intact between the public and a royal residence, between curiosity and security. The Grisly Gazette. And the institution itself has noticed where the friction comes from. In recent years, recognizing a gap in communication between the guards and the public, the royal household has provided further training to strengthen the soldiers' communication skills and help them handle situations with more thoughtfulness and diplomacy. So even the silence is evolving. The men are being taught not just to hold the line, but to hold it with a little more grace. The Grisly Gazette. There's a quiet irony underneath all of this that's worth nomming. Many of the people who online defend the guards and criticize badly behaved tourists will, when they actually visit the palace themselves, act as if they don't know the rules at all. It is easy to admire discipline from a distance. It is harder to respect a boundary when you are the one standing in front of it with a camera. The Grisly Gazette. Now let's go back to where we started, to Clarence house, and to the figure of the Queen. People are often surprised to learn how interwoven Queen Camilla's life already was with these very regiments, long before she was ever queen. She married her first husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, then a Guards officer, a lieutenant in the Blues and Royals in 1973, in a Catholic ceremony at the Guards Chapel, Wellington Barracks in London. Wellington Barracks. The same barracks where every morning the new guard forms up before marching to Buckingham Palace. The threads of her story and theirs were crossing decades ago, in the same few hundred yards of London. Wikipedia. Today her role with the wider household and the armed forces is a serious one. She is the patron or president of more than 100 charities and organizations, and serves as Honorary Commodore-in-Chief of the Royal Navy Medical Service, a role in which she has awarded medals to naval medical teams returning from service in Afghanistan. When the king was undergoing cancer treatment in 2024, she deputized for him at the Commonwealth Day service at Westminster Abbey and at the Royal Maundy, becoming the first consort to hand out the ceremonial coins at that event. Wikipedia. Wikipedia. I mention this because it reframes the relationship between the Queen and the Guard entirely. It is not a story of demands and refusals. It is a story of two parts of the same institution, one ceremonial, one personal, moving in the same long tradition. The soldier at Clarence House and the Queen behind its doors are, in the truest sense, on the same side of the fence. So let's come back, finally, to that man standing in front of the palace. He cannot eat. He cannot sit. He cannot answer the child who waves at him or the stranger who mocks him. If he reacts, even when provoked, it may cost him his standing. If he faints, he is meant to faint at attention. He may stand there for 2 hours in heavy wool in the heat, holding a real rifle, guarding a real residence, as part of a tradition that hands palace keys from one set of hands to another every single morning. And he does it, day after day, knowing that most of the people photographing him will never understand any of it. That's the thing about discipline this complete. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. A man is simply standing still, but everything is happening. Every minute he holds that line, he is making a choice to be steady when it would be easier to move, to be silent when it would be easier to answer, to stay when every nerve says shift your weight just once. We tend to celebrate the loud kinds of courage, the shout, the charge, the dramatic stand. But there is another kind, older and quieter, that asks a person to do something almost harder, to be perfectly, completely still, and to let that stillness be the whole of his service. The next time you stand in front of one of these men and he doesn't move, don't mistake it for emptiness. You're not looking at a statue. You're looking at one of the most disciplined performances of duty in the world, and the discipline is the message. So far we've stood outside Buckingham Palace, watching the men in red coats and bearskins hold a stillness most people couldn't manage for 10 minutes. But there's a part of this story that the postcard view leaves out. The guard is not one thing. It is many, and some of its men don't stand still at all. They sit instead on top of a horse. Let's walk a little way from the palace down toward Whitehall, to a place with a name so literal it almost sounds invented: Horse Guards. This is where you'll find the other face of the King's Guard, and it's a strikingly different one. The King's Life Guard is a body of soldiers whose origins reach back to 1660, posted at Horse Guards, the formal entrance to both Buckingham Palace and St. James's Palace. They don't look like the foot sentries. They wear breastplates, helmets, and carry swords, and the key difference is that they are mounted on horses. Grunge grun. Now, there's a temptation to think of those horses as part of the costume. Beautiful animals, polished and still, there for the photographs. That misunderstanding is exactly what causes most of the trouble. The horses are not props. They are treated as important members of the guard, and tourists are expected to respect them and not interfere with their duties. But excitement gets the better of people. Some visitors approach, grab the reins to say hello or pose for a photo, and this is a serious breach, the kind that will get you shouted at. Grunge grun. And the protocol here, just like with the foot sentries, is a careful escalation rather than an explosion. A mounted guard will shout a firm warning, some version of "do not touch the reins," until the person lets go, and that usually does the trick. But there's a second move if the warning is ignored, and it's quietly clever. If the person doesn't release the rein in good time, the guard simply directs the horse away from them and returns to his post, so that both the horse and the soldier can carry on their duty without being dragged into a confrontation. Grunge grun. Think about the restraint in that. Faced with someone who won't let go, the trained response isn't force, it's to remove the animal from the situation entirely. The job comes first. The confrontation is something to be avoided, not won. That tells you something about how these men are taught to think. The duty is the goal, and everything else, including their own pride in the moment, is secondary to it. Now let me clear up something that confuses almost everyone who visits London. People assume the man outside the palace and the man with the gun guarding the family are the same kind of soldier. They are not, and the difference matters enormously. The men in the red coats, the famous ceremonial guard, are one thing, but the people who actually protect the royal family up close, day to day, are something else entirely, and you'd struggle to pick them out of a crowd. In contrast to the royal guard, whose work is primarily ceremonial, the everyday members of the Royalty Protection Service dress in plain clothes and are deliberately more inconspicuous. No bearskins, no red, just ordinary-looking people, watching everything. Grunge. These officers are a different breed with different rules. They are among the very few metropolitan police officers permitted to carry firearms, with most carrying a standard military-issue Glock pistol, along with radios and emergency first aid kits. And who gets that protection is a carefully managed question. Full-time armed security, funded by taxpayer money, is provided for King Charles and Queen Camilla, as well as Prince William and Princess Catherine and their 3 children. The decision is made at the discretion of the police, based on the perceived threat to each family member, which is why more junior or non-working members of the family don't receive the same round-the-clock coverage. Grunge +2. So when you picture Queen Camilla moving through her day, the real security around her isn't the soldier in the bearskin at Clarence's house. It's the quiet figure in an ordinary coat, standing a little too still at the edge of the room, watching the doors. The ceremonial guard is the symbol. The protection officer is the shield. 2 completely different jobs, often within a few yards of each other, and most people never tell them apart. And lest anyone imagine these protection officers as flawless action heroes, the history has its very human moments. There was an occasion when a guard accidentally fired his weapon while trying to unload it inside St. James's Palace, nearly hitting a soldier before the bullet ricocheted off the ground and broke a window. Real people, real mistakes. The institution carries on regardless. Grun. Let's go somewhere older now. Somewhere the guard has stood for far longer than any palace forecourt, the Tower of London. If Buckingham Palace is where the guard performs for the world, the Tower is where it does its most ancient and serious work, because of what's kept inside. The King's Guard at the Tower is provided by one of the 5 Foot Guards regiments and consists of 1 officer, 6 non-commissioned officers and 15 soldiers, and their posting is specific. A sentry stands outside the Jewel House, where the crown jewels are kept, and another outside the Queen's house. Unofficial royalty, unofficial royalty. Guarding the crown jewels is not a one-regiment affair, though. Protecting the Tower is a joint effort between the King's Guard, the yeoman warders, the famous beefeaters, and the Jewel House wardens. 3 different bodies layered around the same treasure, each with its own role. Unofficial royalty. And the Tower holds on to a ritual so old it sounds like something out of a storybook, and yet it happens every single day. There is a password, a real one. At 3 in the afternoon, the officer of the guard and an escort march to the Byward Tower to collect the word, the daily changing password required for after-hours entry to the Tower, used by the staff, the residents, and the soldiers on duty. Unofficial royalty. Sit with that for a second. In a city of contactless payments and facial recognition, there is a fortress in the middle of London where, every afternoon, soldiers march to collect a spoken password that changes by the day. Not as a tourist show, as a functioning part of how the place is secured at night. The old ways didn't disappear here. They just kept working. Now, I've mentioned the Foot Guards regiments more than once, and I want to give them their due, because to a casual eye they all look identical, same red, same bearskin, and that sameness hides a real depth of history. There are 5 of them, and they are not interchangeable. The Grenadier Guards are the most senior infantry regiment of the British Army and the premier ceremonial regiment. They traditionally provide the pallbearers for deceased monarchs, most recently for Queen Elizabeth II. Let that land. When the late Queen was carried to her rest, the hands that bore her were Grenadier Guards. The same regiment whose men you photograph standing silent outside the palace carried a sovereign on her final journey. Unofficial royalty. The others each carry their own weight of history too. The Coldstream Guards are the oldest continuously serving regular regiment in the British Army, and their band plays at the changing of the guard, at state visits, and at countless other occasions. Alongside them stand the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh Guards, 5 regiments, taking their turns, so that the line outside the palace is never empty. Unofficial royalty. And here's a detail to carry with you, because it turns people watching into something richer. You can actually read which regiment is on duty from the buttons on the tunic. The Grenadiers wear their buttons singly and carry a grenade as their collar badge. The Coldstream Guards wear theirs in pairs. Next time you stand in that crowd, look at the spacing of the buttons. You're no longer looking at a generic guard. You're looking at a specific regiment, with its own battles and its own dead and its own particular pride, taking its turn at a duty that rotates between brothers in arms. Unofficial royalty. Let's pull all of these threads back together, because there's a single idea running underneath all of it. The guard you see at Buckingham Palace, the mounted life guard at Whitehall, the plainclothes officer beside the Queen, the sentry outside the Jewel House collecting a spoken password at 3 o'clock, these are not separate worlds. They are the same instinct expressed in different uniforms. The instinct to draw a line and hold it. To say, this far and no further, whether the boundary is a palace fence, a horse's reins, the door of a family's home, or the cage around a crown. What's remarkable is how rarely that line is held with force. We've now walked through the whole system, and notice what's almost absent from it: violence. The man being mocked is taught to absorb it. The mounted guard being grabbed simply walks the horse away. The escalation protocols are built, stage by stage, to give a person every chance to step back before anything sharpens. The force is there, the rifle, the bayonet, the Glock, but it sits at the very end of a long, patient sequence designed, above all, to never be needed. That is the part that the dramatic version of this story always gets wrong. People want a confrontation, a demand, a refusal, a stunned silence, a guard standing nose to nose with someone powerful. But the truth of these men is the opposite of drama. Their entire training is built to make drama unnecessary, to hold a line so calmly and so completely that the conflict dissolves before it can begin. There's an old idea in soldiering that the finest discipline is the kind nobody ever has to see in action. The guard who never has to raise his rifle. The protection officer whose day ends with nothing to report. The sentry at the Jewel House for whom the most eventful moment is collecting a password at 3. By that measure, the British Royal Guard, in all its forms, is among the most disciplined bodies of soldiers in the world, precisely because, on most days, nothing happens at all. And so we end where we began, with a man standing still. Except now you know what's standing behind him. 3.5 centuries of practice. 5 regiments taking their turns. A mounted troop down the road and a spoken password across the city. A plainclothes shield you'll never notice. And a code, never written on the postcard, that says the highest form of duty is to hold your ground so steadily that no one ever sees you fight for it. The man doesn't move. By now, you understand that the stillness was never the absence of action. It was the action all along. We've spent a long time now admiring the discipline. The stillness, the protocol, the centuries of practice. But there's a question I've been holding back, and it's the one that really tests everything we've said. What happens when all of it fails? When the silence and the sentries and the alarms and the walls, when none of it works and someone simply walks in? Because it has happened. And the most famous time it happened, the intruder didn't end up in a corridor or a courtyard. He ended up sitting on the edge of the Queen's bed. Let me take you back to the early hours of the 9th of July, 1982. At around 6 in the morning, a man named Michael Fagan scaled Buckingham Palace's perimeter wall, 14 feet high, topped with revolving spikes and barbed wire, and climbed up a drain pipe. Just sit with that opening image. A wall built to be unclimbable, crowned with spikes designed to turn, so a hand can't grip them, and a man going over it anyway. In the gray light before dawn, Wikipedia. Here is where the story stops being about the wall and starts being about something far harder to defend against human assumption. An alarm sensor detected his movement, but the police thought the alarm was faulty and silenced it. Wikipedia. Read that again because it's the hinge the whole night turns on. The system worked. The sensor did its job. A machine somewhere registered an intruder and raised the alarm exactly as designed. And a person decided the machine was wrong. The technology didn't fail. The faith in it did. What followed almost defies belief. Fagan wandered the corridors for several minutes before reaching the royal apartments. Inside a building with hundreds of rooms, a stranger walked the halls unchallenged. By some accounts, he made his way toward the private apartment simply by following the pictures on the walls, the royal portraits growing grander as he got closer to their subject. Wikipedia biography. And then the moment that froze the country. In an anteroom, he broke a glass ashtray, cutting his hand, and he entered the bedroom of Queen Elizabeth II at around 7:15, carrying a fragment of glass. The Queen woke when he disturbed a curtain. Wikipedia. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of moment that legend reshapes over time. For years, the popular version had the Queen sitting calmly on the edge of the bed, talking with the intruder for a long while. But in a later interview, Fagan himself said the Queen immediately ran from the room, barefoot and quickly. The romantic image of a composed monarch chatting with her intruder makes a better story, but the man who was actually there described something far more human and frightening. I'd trust the version that doesn't flatter anyone. Wikipedia. And then comes the detail that should make every part of this story land with full weight. The Queen telephoned the palace switchboard twice for police. None arrived, so she used her bedside alarm bell. One report notes that her calls didn't trigger any urgency, partly because of how calm her voice was. The alarm bell rang in a place where, after the night shift had ended, no one was there to hear it. Wikipedia biography. Picture that. The most protected woman in the country, a stranger with a piece of broken glass in her bedroom, and her calls for help going unanswered, not because the systems didn't exist, but because, at that exact hour, the human beings who were meant to respond simply weren't in place. In the end, she managed to catch the eye of a maid, and together they coaxed Fagan into a pantry by offering him a cigarette, buying time until help finally came. Biography. It was, by any honest measure, one of the most serious royal security failures in modern memory. So why am I telling you a story about the system breaking in a piece that spent 2 parts praising its discipline? Because this is the part that proves the point. The guard's stillness, the protocol, the obsessive standards we walked through, none of that is theater. It exists precisely because of mornings like this one. The discipline isn't decoration on top of a safe building. It's the thing standing between order and the morning of July 9th, 1982. And the truly revealing detail is what the system did wrong that day. It wasn't a lack of walls. It wasn't a lack of alarms. A later investigation concluded that the cause lay in a failure of communication between officers. One had seen Fagan climbing the railings and passed the message along, but no action was taken, and an alarm in one of the palace rooms also went unanswered. Every individual piece of the machine worked. What failed was the human glue between the pieces. Biography. That, more than anything, is why the men we've been watching are trained the way they are. You cannot drill a person to never make a mistake, but you can drill a standard so deep, stamp, warn, escalate, respond, never assume, never stand easy, that the discipline holds even when judgment wavers. The Fagan morning is the negative image of everything the guard is built to be. It shows you exactly what the silence is protecting against. There's a sobering footnote, too, one that says something about how much times have changed. Because his actions were, at the time, a civil wrong rather than a criminal offense, Fagan was not charged with trespassing in the Queen's bedroom. Let that sink in. A man walked into the sovereign's bedroom, and the law as it then stood had no crime to charge him with for being there. It wasn't until 2005, when Buckingham Palace was made a designated site under the Serious Organized Crime and Police Act, that trespassing at the palace became a criminal offense. Wikipedia. 23 years. That's how long it took for the law to catch up to what that morning revealed. The walls were old. The alarms existed. But the legal line, the one that said you simply cannot be here, wasn't drawn in hard ink until decades later. Sometimes the most important boundaries are the invisible ones, and sometimes it takes a crisis to make a society finally draw them. And here's something the Fagan story makes clear that's easy to forget. That morning was not a freak, one-off event. Palace break-ins were not entirely uncommon in that era. The records from those years read almost like a pattern. In June 1981, 3 German visitors climbed a wall into the palace gardens, apparently believing they were entering Hyde Park. Weeks later, a man was found on the grounds. And not long before Fagan's bedroom intrusion, another man got past 2 guards by showing a knife. Biography. 3 Germans who thought a royal palace was a public park. It would be almost funny if it weren't so telling. The line between famous London landmark and the monarch's fortified home is, in the public mind, surprisingly thin. People wander toward it the way they'd wander toward any attraction. And that, in the end, is the daily reality the guard lives inside, not dramatic assassins, but a constant, low tide of people who don't quite register where they are or what the rules mean. Which loops us right back to the tourists from part 1. Remember the man fined 10 days in barracks for reacting to a tourist who grabbed his rifle. Remember the fences that crept inward year after year after each incident. Now you understand the weight behind all of it. Every one of those small adjustments, the rope at Windsor, the post moved behind the railings in 1959, the sentries pulled back from the public, each was a quiet correction made by an institution that knows, from hard experience, exactly how thin that line really is. They are not overreacting. They have read the same history we just have. So let's draw all 3 parts together, because we've traveled a long way from where we started. We began with a man standing still outside a palace looking, to the casual eye, like a statue. We learned what that stillness actually costs: the 2-hour tour, the ban on so much as standing easy, the discipline so total that a man is meant to faint at attention rather than break his posture. We walked down to horse guards and met the mounted lifeguard, and learned that even there, faced with a tourist who won't let go of the reins, the trained answer is restraint, not force. We separated the ceremonial guard from the plainclothes officer, who is the real shield. We stood at the tower, where the crown jewels are watched and a spoken password is still collected at 3 o'clock each afternoon, as if the centuries never passed. And now, finally, we've seen the other side of the coin. The morning the whole apparatus stumbled, and a man with a piece of broken glass reached the Queen herself. We've seen what happens when the discipline lapses, even briefly, even in just the human spaces between the machines. And here's the thing that ties it all together. The greatness of the guard was never in the spectacle. It was never really about the red coats or the tall caps or the perfect drill that draws the cameras. It was always about the line, the unglamorous, exhausting, mostly invisible work of holding a boundary so steadily that nothing ever crosses it. The Fagan morning is famous precisely because it was the rare exception. On every other morning for centuries, nothing happened. And nothing happened is not the absence of the story. It is the story. It is the whole point. We tend to measure heroism by what we can see. The charge, the rescue, the dramatic stand. But the truest guardianship is the kind that leaves no trace at all. The threat that never materialized because the line held. The intruder who never got over the wall because someone, somewhere, refused to assume the alarm was faulty. The man standing motionless outside the palace will almost certainly never have a morning like July 9th, 1982. And that, the fact that his whole career may pass without a single dramatic moment, is not a sign that his discipline was wasted. It's the proof that it worked. So the next time you stand in that crowd and watch one of those soldiers refuse to meet your eye, hold all of this in your mind. The centuries behind him. The regiments taking their turns, the mounted troop and the spoken password and the plainclothes shield, and one gray morning in 1982 that reminds everyone still why the silence is never allowed to slip. He doesn't move, he won't move, and by now you know the truth that the postcards never tell you. The stillness was never nothing. It was a promise held hour after hour that the line will not break on his watch. And most days it doesn't.